The night is quiet enough for breathing to sound like waves. Out here, far from roads and lamplight and all the steel-bright clamor of the present day, a hush spreads wide as an ocean. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what's the time there. Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for being the part of my community. Let's get started. Even the listener's pulse seems to slow, as though it has remembered an older rhythm, one kept by wind and water when the world itself was young. If you close your eyes and let the darkness settle, the hush will draw you backwards, past engines, past sails, past the first spark struck from flint, drift, slowly, softly, through veils of time until only the moon remains, polished like bone above a silver sea. In that hush, a single feather rides the wind, dark as wet stone, guiding you toward an island whose name was never written down. The island is neither large nor lush. It is a thumb of volcanic rock planted in the North Atlantic swell, ringed by broken columns of basalt where waves gnaw day and night. Mist beads on lichen and seeps into every crevice. Salt crusts the stone in white lace that glimmers when morning breaks clear. Gulls wheel overhead, their voices raw enough to tear canvas, yet the stone swallows the sound until only a faint echo lingers. This is a quiet place. Quiet the way a held breath is quiet, poised between heartbeat and exhale. Long before cartographers pressed quills to parchment, the island belonged to winter. Summers were brief flickers of softness, 3, perhaps 4 bright months when the sun rose early and dallied late, pouring pale gold upon the sea. The rest of the year belonged to wind, a tireless sculptor that rasped the stone, hissed through kelp forests, and painted the water with white, feathered spray. Sea ice drifted close each January, its creaking calliope muffled under snow. Beneath those slabs, Atlantic cod and capelin gathered in clouds as wide as churches, scales flashing pewter in the gloom. The island's waters brimmed with life, though little of it breached the surface except to breathe. Yet some creatures needed no invitation to stay above the waves. They had small wings, stubby as oars, and sleek bodies shaped not for flight but for plunging. Their feathers were black as kittiwake cliffs on back and crown, white as thawed seafoam along neck and belly, with a narrow ribbon of charcoal tracing each eye like ink on parchment. Their beaks were deep, ridged, ivory-tipped, tools for catching fish in a single swift snap. They waddled upright upon webbed feet and carried themselves with a gravity that made the whole colony seem like monks in feathered robes. These were the great auks. And in the beginning, as all good beginnings should, they were innumerable. At dawn, they crowded every ledge and spit, shoulder to shoulder, redolent of salt and oil and the briny tang of half-digested capelin. When the sun poured its white fire over the water, thousands slipped in unison from rock to sea, wings beating once or twice in a parody of flight before folding tight against their sides. They vanished. Moments later, they surfaced farther out, sleek heads glistening, beaks already clasping silver prizes. Imagine the sound from shore. Not a raucous chaos the way the gulls provided, but a murmured roar, like a distant falls flattened under linen. Each auk call was low, a gruff croak, yet multiplied by thousands it became a lullaby for basalt and cloud. The rocks drank it in. The sea answered with its own deep percussion. Above all that music, the wind traced a single, unbroken note, high and thin as the whistle of a kettle left upon hot stone. Among the many birds on that first morning walked one whose feathers shone with unusual luster, perhaps only because we look for a single story within multitudes. She stood tall, for an auk, that is to say, taller than a rabbit, shorter than a fox, and her eyes held tiny twin moons of reflected light. She was not yet a mother, No egg had warmed beneath her breast. Still, she carried in her bones the shape of nests and the weight of fledglings not yet dreamed. She felt it most keenly when the tide turned, when the ocean inhaled and the whole world seemed to tip toward possibility. While daylight lingered, she dove. Water welcomed her like cool silk, swallowing every sound except the faint crackle of air trapped against feathers. Deeper, light fractured into wavering lattices. Caplin shimmered by in twisting ribbons. She sheared through them, beak closing on 3, perhaps 4 fish before her lungs bid her rise. At the surface, she gulped fresh air, water streaming from her back in rivulets. The fish she swallowed whole, letting their cold salt slide down as sustenance and song. Each evening, when the sun flared red, then slid beneath the horizon, the colony gathered again on stone. Their bodies pressed close, sealing warmth beneath shared feathers. The basalt felt their weight, carried it the way ancient roots grip earth. Clouds unfurled overhead, catching last color like sails turned to dusk. When stars showed, sharp, innumerable, the auks tucked beaks under wings. Only a few night-hungry gulls remained awake, drifting above the dark sea like scraps of torn parchment drifting upon ink. Time poured forward in waves. Weeks dissolved into weather, into muscle memory and hunger, into the measured tide of life that knows no clocks. She grew sleek with good fishing. Her molt came and went, leaving new feathers glossy and tight. She stood taller now amid the ledges, instincts stirring like surf beneath ice. The island itself shifted so subtly no living creature noticed. Lichen crept millimeters across stone. A storm split one broken pillar. It collapsed into the surf, raising a plume of pearl-gray spray that froze before touching water. But the colony remained. They always had, they always would. So said the rhythm in their hearts. So said the promises hidden in the turning of seasons. Early one summer, long before dawn's frost had lifted from the moss, she met a mate. Courtship among great auks was simple. A measured bow, a mutual nod, a low croak exchanged like a vow. They mirrored each other's movements, tracing slow semicircles across the ledge, touching beaks in quiet confirmation. Around them, dozens of pairs performed the same ritual beneath a rising chorus of morning gulls. Yet for our two, the world narrowed to a pulse of surf and shared breath. They chose a hollow between 2 weather-rounded boulders only 20 paces up from high tide. There, winds were gentle, and the sun touched late enough to keep eggs cool. She patted the shallow bowl with strands of dried kelp, shards of down, even a fragment of driftwood pale as bone. Side by side, they waited, patient as stone. When the egg arrived, it was cream speckled with coffee-brown blotches, large enough to fill her webbed feet. She cupped it beneath her belly, warmth pooling into shell. Her mate stood close, head high, scanning horizon and ledge. Though they could not fly, they were not defenseless. Auks bit hard, and that bite had driven away foxes on other islands. But here, on this ocean tooth of rock, predators were few. The greatest danger came from storms, and storms were still weeks away. While she brooded, the world flowed past in brilliant, silent rivers. Fog curled in like thread, unspooling against cliffs. Sunlight spilled, collected, vanished. Her mate brought fish to her each evening, laying them at her beak tip, then diving again for his own meal. Hunger never sharpened into pain. It eased at rest, lulled by trust and the gentle weight of promise inside the shell. Sometimes, after moonrise, she heard whales singing beyond the reef, long, mournful pulses that traveled through water and stone. The sound rose into her bones until she felt carved hollow enough to carry echoes forever. She pressed her breast more firmly to the egg, as if shore and sea together might teach the chick that ancient melody before it breathed its first. July brightened, and the colony buzzed with expectation. Eggs everywhere shuddered, tapped from within. She felt a tremor run across the shell's curve, so slight it might have been wind. Another tremor answered, surer, followed by a crisp crack. She crooned softly, low, rumbling. The chick inside chipped away at that boundary, shell fragments falling in chalky crescents onto kelp bedding. But dawn had only just begun to pale the east. It would be hours still before the tiny beak broke through, before wet feathers met cold air, before new eyes found the wide blue canvas of sea and sky. Around her, other parents stirred, stretching wings, uttering hoarse lullabies to shells shifting beneath them. Above, the moon drifted toward the horizon, white, waning, reluctant to leave. Its glow touched the water where currents tangled, painting silver ripples that glided toward shore. Each shimmer looked, for a heartbeat, like a reflection of a bird yet unborn, a promise winging across time. She settled her weight once more, closed her eyes, and listened. To the muffled beating in the shell, to the breathing of her mate beside her, to the rolling hush of tide against basalt. The island held its breath. The stories of feathers and stone were only beginning. And somewhere beneath her, warm, fragile, determined, life pressed onward, straining toward its first full breath of salt, sweet air. The egg rocked in its bed of kelp and down, each movement a small heartbeat against the stillness of morning. The pale, blotched shell was cool on its outer curve, but warm where her breast had sheltered it through the night. She could feel the faint taps from within, small, stubborn, and certain. Her mate stood nearby, one eye on the horizon where a bank of low clouds crept in, the other fixed on the ledge below, where gulls and murreys shuffled for space. The tide was turning, sighing against the stone. The first true crack came just as the sun's edge cleared the rim of the sea. Light spilled over the basalt, catching the salt in tiny glints. She shifted slightly, lowering her beak to nudge the shell. The chick's tiny bill pushed back, determined. She crooned, a low, gravelly sound that matched the rhythm of the waves. Piece by piece, the shell broke away, slivers falling into the hollow until a damp head pushed free, eyes sealed tight, feathers no more than slick threads of dark and pale. The chick lay still for a moment, breathing hard, its chest fluttering. She tucked it close, her warmth seeping in. The smell of it, new life, mixed with the tang of salt, rose into the air. When its eyes opened, they were dark and clear, mirroring the basalt cliffs. The first thing it saw was her face leaning close, and behind her, the soft blur of sea and sky. For the first days it barely left her shadow. She guarded it from wind with the curve of her body, fed it morsels of fish her mate brought from the shoals beyond the reef. He returned often, diving and reappearing with silver prizes clamped in his beak. Each delivery was greeted with a soft croak from her and a hungry chirp from the chick. The little one learned quickly, tilting its head back and swallowing the fish whole, eyes bright with each gulp. The world beyond their nesting hollow was a constant, murmuring presence. The sea never rested, sometimes breathing in long, slow swells, sometimes speaking in sharp, white bursts against the rock. Overhead, the sky shifted from deep blue to pale silver, from mist-softened gray to the heavy gold of afternoon. The colony moved with these changes, diving when the water was calm, huddling together when fog rolled in, thick enough to hide the nearest ledge. On the third morning, the chick followed her to the edge of their hollow. Its legs were still unsteady, its body small and rounded, down fluffing against the breeze. From here, it could see the slope of the rock to the sea, where hundreds of auks stood or slipped into the water. The gulls' cries came sharper, and the scent of brine deepened with the wind. She touched her beak to the chick's head, then led it back to shelter. The sea would wait. The days blurred into a rhythm. The slow climb of the sun, the return of the mate with food, the chick's growing confidence. Each evening, the light lingered on the waves, painting them in shifting colors, rose, silver, deepening blue, until stars pricked the surface of the sky. Under that starlight, the colony murmured itself to rest. The warmth of feathers pressed together. The breathing of so many bodies became as much a part of the chick's world as the salt in the air. It grew stronger, its down beginning to give way to the sleek feathers of its kind. Its legs steadied, its eyes followed the diving shapes of other auks with restless interest. It learned the sound of its parents' calls among the hundreds of voices, turning its head quickly when it heard them. And though it had yet to touch the water, it dreamed of it, of the silver flash of fish, the cool press of depth, the buoyant lift to the surface. One morning, the wind shifted, coming from the east, carrying with it a new scent. Kelp and something older, deeper. She led the chick again to the edge of the hollow. Below, the sea was calm, the surface trembling only slightly in the light. The tide had pulled back, revealing slick shelves of stone. The gulls drifted higher as if making room. Her mate waited at the shoreline, a fish in his beak, calling in low, steady notes. The chick hesitated. The distance between stone and surf seemed vast, though it was only a short slope. She stepped closer, brushing its side with her wing. Slowly, with quick glances at her and then at the water, it began to walk. The wind lifted the first loose feather from its back. It spun away, caught in a beam of sunlight. Step by step, they made their way down until the cold spray touched their feet. The sea's voice grew louder here, each swell folding and breaking with a deep, rolling hush. The chick stared at the water, blinking against the spray, then looked up at her. She stepped forward into the surf, letting the waves part around her. With a shiver, it followed. The water closed gently around its legs, then its body. She crooned softly, and they moved together, the current swaying them like kelp in the tide. The chick's first swim was short, just a few moments before it turned back to the rock, but in those moments the sea had claimed it. The salt on its feathers, the cool embrace, the strange weightlessness would call it back again and again. For now, it shook itself, blinking, then huddled against her as they climbed back to the nesting hollow. Above them, the sky had cleared to a pure, endless blue. The wind was warm on their feathers, and far out, beyond the reef, the horizon shimmered, wide, waiting, and full of a life the chick had only begun to imagine. The sea was different when you were in it. From the ledge above, it had seemed like a sheet of shifting glass, sometimes calm, sometimes restless, always apart from the stone. But from within, the water wrapped around the body, soft and cold at once, holding and lifting in ways the chick could not have imagined. It pressed gently at the chest, curled against the wings, lapped over the head in quick, startling kisses. And beneath that surface the light broke into silver shards, spinning across the dark. That first swim had been only moments, yet it had left a taste of salt and a hunger the chick did not yet have the words for. Now, as the days drew on, it would wake with the pull of the tide in its bones. The ledge felt smaller. The stone was steady but unmoving, while the sea shifted and shimmered beyond it, promising something more. Its parents seemed to know. They no longer kept it confined to the nesting hollow. Instead, they let it down to the water's edge each morning, when the tide was gentle. The chick waded a little deeper each time, the waves slipping coolly over its back. Soon, it learned the small downward push of its wings to dive and the upward sweep to rise again, breaking the surface with a wet gasp. Her mate often swam alongside the chick, showing it how to follow the swell instead of fight it, how to let the water's own rhythm carry you forward. The mother would watch from just beyond, her dark head cutting a steady line through the rippling blue. When the chick surfaced with its first tiny fish wriggling between its beak, her croak was low and approving, a note carried from her chest into the water. Above them, the sky stretched without end. The chick learned to read it as much as the sea, how clouds hinted at wind to come, how a sudden clearing meant the glare would strike the surface and make it harder to see below. The great wheeling gulls became markers of distance and depth, their shadows sliding over the water in slow arcs. By midday, the colony was alive with movement. Parents returned from dives, heads shining wet in the sun, beaks holding fish for their young. Some rested on the rocks, eyes half closed, wings slightly lifted to dry. The air smelled of brine, kelp, and the faint oiliness of feathers. Everywhere, the sound of low calls and the occasional slap of water against stone. The chick grew bolder, swimming farther from the shallows. Once, it followed its father beyond the kelp line, where the water darkened to an almost indigo shade and the swell grew stronger. Here, the sea felt older, deeper. Schools of caplin shimmered just beyond reach, each turn of their bodies sending a flash of light into the gloom. The father dived suddenly, his shape vanishing into the green-blue dim. The chick hovered at the surface, scanning. When he rose again, fish gleamed from his beak. He offered one, and the chick took it whole, tasting the cold freshness of the deep. Evenings were quieter. After the day's swimming, they climbed back to the ledge, their feathers heavy with salt water until the wind dried them soft again. The chick would nestle between its parents, the steady rise and fall of their breathing lulling it into a half-sleep. Sometimes, as it drifted, it would hear the deep, far-off song of whales, long, bending notes that seemed to hum through the stone itself. The first storm of its life came without warning. The morning had been calm, the sea a soft gray under a thin mist. By afternoon the wind rose, driving sharp spray against the rock. Waves crashed higher, white foam curling over the lower ledges. The colony huddled together, heads turned into the wind, bodies close. The chick pressed into the shelter of its mother's side, her feathers warm despite the cold air. The roar of the water filled the world. It learned then that the sea could be many things, gentle, nourishing, playful, but also vast, relentless, and loud enough to drown every other sound. Yet even in the storm, the water called. When the tide eased the next day, it was eager to swim again, its strokes stronger, its dives lasting longer. By the time the summer sun began to slip lower in the sky, the chick was nearly grown. Its down had been replaced by sleek black and white feathers. It could swim alongside its parents for long stretches, diving to chase small fish and rising again with droplets scattering into the air. It knew the taste of deep water and the weightless joy of gliding through it. Still, it could not yet know what waited beyond this first season. The pull of migration, the return to the island, the endless rhythm of sea and stone. For now, its world was enough. Waves beneath, sky above, and the two steady figures always near, leading it further each day into the life it was born to live. And far out on the horizon, where the light bled into the sea, the unseen currents whispered of places it had yet to go. Summer's warmth, though brief in these northern seas, arrived like a quiet blessing. The winds softened, the mist thinned, and the sun poured itself generously over the basalt ledges, lingering long into the evening. The ocean's surface, once restless with winter storms, smoothed into a deep and gleaming plain. From horizon to horizon, the light played on the waves like molten silver, and the air was full of sound. The low calls of the auks, the splash of diving bodies, the chatter of gulls weaving between them. This was the season when life thrived in such abundance it seemed endless. Shoals of capelin, herring, and sand eels gathered in dark, shifting clouds just beneath the surface, their scales flashing with each turn. The water was alive with motion, and the great auks answered it with tireless dives. They moved in pairs or small groups, disappearing into the cool blue, wings folded tight against their bodies, legs propelling them with strong, practiced strokes. When they returned, it was with beaks full, the silver fish still twisting as they were brought to the waiting chicks. The colony swelled with activity. Everywhere on the ledges, the black and white forms of the auks stood shoulder to shoulder, their deep-set eyes bright in the sunlight. Some guarded their nests, others preened their feathers in the sun, while pairs exchanged low, murmured calls, touching beaks in greeting after long hours at sea. The chicks, now nearly grown, tested their wings and legs along the rock, making short, splashing entries into the shallows before scrambling back to their parents. Our young auk, sleek now in her new plumage, swam further each day, her confidence growing with every dive. She learned the subtle shifts of the current, the way a cloud of fish might scatter at a sudden shadow, the patience needed to circle and wait until they gathered again. Her parents still guided her, but often she would slip away for a time, tracing her own paths through the kelp forests, darting after the flash of a tail. The water was no longer a mystery, it was her home. Beyond the main colony, smaller islets rose from the sea like scattered stones in a vast garden. These were the summer's true treasures, places where fish were plentiful, where predators were scarce, and where the wind carried the scent of open water. The auks visited them in great numbers, filling every ledge and hollow. On calm days, the sea between the islands shimmered with the movement of hundreds of birds, all diving and surfacing in a slow, unbroken rhythm. From above, the view was one of perfect balance. Stone, sea, and ski woven together, life moving seamlessly between them. Beneath the surface, sunlight reached down in shifting columns, illuminating the dance of plankton, the slow drift of jellyfish, the sudden dart of a fish pursued. The young auk learned to love these hidden places, the green sway of kelp stems anchored deep in the rock, the quiet grottos where fish rested in the shade, the sudden burst of bubbles when a seal glided past in silence. Evenings brought the colony together again. The setting sun painted the basalt in warm gold, and the water turned to molten copper before fading to deep indigo. The air cooled quickly, and the auks stood close, their bodies pressed together, feathers fluffed to hold the day's heat. The younger birds dozed easily, their dreams still full of swimming. Older pairs remained watchful, eyes scanning the edge of the sea where the horizon met the night. Sometimes, when the moon rose full over the water, the ledges shone silver, and the waves glittered as if dusted with stars. On those nights, the colony's calls softened to a near whisper. The young auk would lie between her parents, the warmth of their bodies steady against the cool air, and watch the sky as if it too were a great ocean, full of shapes and paths waiting to be explored. This was the season of plenty, when the sea gave, without hesitation, and every day ended with full bellies and the comfort of many voices. But even in this abundance, the rhythm of life moved forward. Chicks grew, feathers hardened, and the first thoughts of the coming migration stirred, faint and unformed, in the minds of the birds. For now, the islands were enough, a wide, shimmering world of stone and water, where each day began and ended in the company of the sea. And beyond the farthest islet, where the water darkened and the horizon lay unbroken, the currents shifted, already carrying with them the first quiet signs of change. The sun's warmth slipped away as summer folded into autumn, and with it came a change not easily named, but deeply felt. The air grew sharper, each breath a thin ribbon of cold that clung to feathers and stone alike. The sea darkened beneath heavy skies, and the steady rhythm of waves took on a different cadence, slower, heavier, as though the ocean itself was settling into a long, slow sleep. The colony, once bursting with restless movement, now held itself in quiet endurance. The birds huddled closer on wind-battered ledges, feathers fluffed wide to trap whatever warmth remained. Their calls, once loud and frequent, softened to murmurs, low croaks and whispers carried by the cold wind. Nights lengthened, and under the pale, silver gaze of the winter moon, the world seemed to shrink to the scale of stone and breath and the steady pulse of life. Our auk moved among them, her feathers dark against the snow-dusted rocks, eyes sharp and bright despite the chill. She no longer chased fish with the wild eagerness of youth, but dove with measured patience, slipping through the icy waters in long, silent arcs. The sea beneath the surface was a different place now, quieter, colder, filled with shadows and the slow drift of plankton that glowed faintly in the dim light. At times, the water cracked and groaned as sheets of sea ice pushed in from the north, floating like great translucent shields that blotted out the world beneath. The auk would watch from the ledge, head tilted against the wind, as the ice crowded the shore and the waves wrapped themselves around it in frothing white. The cold pressed in on every side, but there was also a strange beauty in this starkness, a fragile stillness that held the promise of rest and renewal. Beneath the moon's pale light, the colony gathered near sheltered hollows, their breath steaming in the air, feathers mingling in tight clusters against the relentless wind. The young auk pressed close to her mate, their bodies a small island of warmth in the vast chill. Together they waited, not with fear, but with the deep quiet of those who have weathered seasons before, whose lives are intertwined with the slow turning of the earth and the relentless flow of the tides. The nights were long, and the stars burned cold and bright overhead, casting their pale fire across the sea and stone. Sometimes, in the deepest hours before dawn, the auk would hear the soft, haunting song of whales far out beyond the ice. Their voices rose and fell in endless waves, carried through the water and into the bones of the land. It was a song older than memory, a lullaby for a world wrapped in frost. Though food was harder to find, the auk's skill did not falter. She dove deeper, lingered longer beneath the surface, moving through the freezing currents with the grace of practiced wings. The fish were fewer, but she found them still, in hidden pockets beneath the ice, in crevices where the water sheltered them from the worst of the cold. Each catch was precious, a small victory won in the endless battle with winter's grip. Around her, others of the colony faced the same quiet struggle. Some faltered, their bodies growing thin beneath the pale sky, but most endured, carried by the strength of the flock and the memory of warmer days. They clung to one another, to the familiar sounds and scents of the island, to the endless song of wind and wave that shaped their lives. In the longest night, when the moon hung low and heavy above the dark sea, the auk rested against her mate. Her feathers ruffled softly in the cold wind, and she closed her eyes to the steady, comforting pulse of his breath. Outside, the world was hushed, frozen in a moment of delicate balance between life and the quiet promise of sleep. And though the winter stretched on, relentless and pale, the island held its breath for the turning of the tide, for the slow return of light, for the first soft notes of spring whispered on the wind. The world of the great auk was never solitary. It was a chorus of wings, a tapestry woven from the songs and movements of many creatures who shared the wind and waves. When winter loosened its grip and the breath of spring returned, the island stirred not only with auks, but with a quiet symphony of life from the sea and sky. Among the basalt ledges and rocky coves, puffins gathered, small bright faces framed by vivid beaks, their black and white feathers a distant mirror to the great auk's own. They darted between the crests of waves, chattering in bursts like scattered pebbles. Nearby, Murrays stood taller, slender and steady, their own voices rising in a chorus of low whistles and croaks that mingled with the auk's deep calls. Seals, with sleek bodies glistening in the sun, rested on sun-warmed rocks, lifting curious heads as the birds passed overhead. Beneath the surface, whales sang long, aching songs that traveled through the water like ancient prayers, resonating with the heartbeat of the ocean itself. The currents carried their voices far, weaving between islands, threading through kelp forests and tide pools, reminding every creature that they were part of a vast, living web. The great auk moved within this community with a quiet strength. It knew the calls and rhythms of its neighbors, understood the changing tides of the sea not just by sight, but by the murmurs carried on the wind. When puffins rose in a flurry, it watched and learned. When seals slipped silently beneath the waves, it shared the same depths, hunting the same shimmering fish. Each morning, as the first light kissed the horizon, the island hummed with the intertwining lives of these beings. The auks rose together, wings beating against the sky, diving in graceful arcs to chase silver shadows beneath the surface. Their flightless bodies glided effortlessly underwater, swift and sure, while above, gulls wheeled and cried, guardians of the cliffs and the air. The young auk, now skilled in the water's embrace, often paused to watch these others. She marveled at the puffin's bold colors and swift, fluttering wings, the murra's calm presence, the seal's playful glides. She felt herself a part of this greater dance, each day learning more about the harmony that sustained them all. Even as the island flourished with life, there was a gentle melancholy in the air, a knowing that the balance was delicate, that the tides of time and change would touch each voice in the choir. But for now, beneath the vast sky and beside the endless sea, the great auk lived in the company of many, a single thread in the rich fabric of the natural world. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over stone and wave, the calls of the colony rose once more. A song of belonging, of survival, and of the quiet wonder that comes from sharing a place in the world with others who move to the same rhythm of wind and tide. The seasons moved with their ancient rhythm, yet beneath the surface of sky and sea, subtle changes whispered on the wind. Soft at first, almost unnoticed. The air held a different weight. The salt taste in the breeze grew faintly warmer, and the currents beneath the waves shifted ever so slightly, carrying with them a hint of something new, something unfamiliar. The great auk, bound deeply to the sea's pulse, felt these changes as a quiet stirring within her bones. The waters where she once found silver schools of capelin now seemed thinner, less crowded with darting shapes. The ocean's song grew more restless, as if it, too, struggled to understand what was coming. The colony gathered on familiar ledges, their bodies pressed close against the increasing wind. The calls between mates and neighbors carried an edge of uncertainty, soft croaks mingling with the harsher cries of gulls circling overhead. Where once the days stretched warm and generous, now the sunlight faltered, and shadows crept earlier over stone. Fish no longer filled the shallows as they had in summers past. The auk learned to dive deeper, to linger longer beneath colder currents, chasing the stubborn remnants of what once was plenty. Each catch became a quiet triumph, a precious offering for herself and her mate, for the chicks yet to hatch. The island itself seemed to sigh beneath the shifting tides. Storms came with unfamiliar ferocity, driving rain and wind against basalt cliffs until spray stung like salt upon the skin. Waves clawed higher at the ledges, washing away nests built with careful patience, scattering kelp and feathers like fragments of memory. Still, the colony endured, bound by the same quiet strength that had carried it through countless seasons. The auk held to the rhythm she had always known, the steady call and response between sea and sky, between her own beating heart and the endless tides. Yet she could not deny the shadows growing at the edges of her world. Sometimes, from the safety of the rocks, she watched the horizon where cold met warmth in a restless dance. Dark clouds gathered there, not only of weather, but of distant ships, strange vessels with white wings of cloth, moving toward the island like great seabirds. Their presence was a new song in the wind, one the auk did not yet understand, but could feel deep in the marrow of her bones. The balance was shifting, slowly but surely. The currents that once promised abundance now carried the faintest notes of loss. The auk stood on the edge of change, where the old world met the new, where survival would demand more than skill in the water or courage on the stone. And beneath the sky, under the watchful eyes of gulls and stars, the colony waited, held together by hope, by memory, and by the endless pulse of the sea. The horizon, once an endless line of sea and sky, began to carry shadows. At first, they were distant shapes, mere silhouettes that stirred the water's surface like dark clouds drifting in a summer breeze. The great auk noticed them quietly, a shift in the air that tugged at the edges of her awareness. The colony watched, too, gathering in clusters on the ledges, their calls lower, more cautious, woven with the instinctive threads of concern. Ships, strange vessels with towering masts and broad sails, moving slowly through the waves, their white wings cutting the sky like giant birds not of this place. The sounds they carried, wood creaking, ropes snapping, voices unlike any the island had heard, rippled across the water, unsettling the ancient calm. From the cliffs, the auk's gaze followed these newcomers as they drew closer to the shore. Men came ashore, their boots heavy on stone, their hands carrying nets and hooks fashioned for the sea but unlike anything the birds had seen. The colony stirred with a restless energy, shifting uneasily as the humans moved among them, strange and intrusive. There was no sudden chaos, no frantic flight. The great auk, with its wings meant for swimming rather than flight, stood its ground, wary but silent. The humans reached into nests, plucking eggs with cold hands, capturing birds with nets that closed like iron traps. Each loss was a quiet fracture in the fabric of the colony, felt in the stillness that followed. Yet the sea continued its song, the endless ebb and flow, the shimmer of fish beneath the surface, the call of whales far beyond the reef. The auk dove deep, chasing shadows that flickered like ghosts, gathering what food remained for itself and its mate. But the air was heavy now with the scent of change, sharp and metallic, mingled with salt and fear. The days grew shorter, the winds colder and harsher. The colony's numbers dwindled, nests lay empty beneath the sun, and the stone echoed with the absence of voices once so many. The great auk felt the weight of loss pressing against her breast, a sorrow deep and silent as the ocean's depths. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the sky was a pale wash of blue and the waves whispered secrets to the shore, she looked out over the water. The shadows still moved there, ships that came and went, carrying away not just fish but pieces of a world slipping beyond reach. And yet, beneath the sorrow, a fierce resilience stirred. The great auk lifted its head against the cold wind, its call rising into the morning air, a sound as old as the sea itself. Though fewer now, the colony remained, bound by memory and hope, clinging to the ledges and the tides, to the promise that the ocean, vast and mysterious, might yet hold a future. The once thunderous chorus of the colony had softened, dwindling to a fragile murmur that seemed almost swallowed by the vastness of sky and sea. The ledges, once crowded and alive with wings and calls, now held more silence than song. Stones, weathered and unyielding, bore witness to this quiet unraveling. The empty nests, the scattered feathers, the stillness where life had thrived. The great auk moved among these cliffs with a measured grace, her eyes reflecting the widening emptiness. She remembered the days when the air was thick with the sound of hundreds, when the salt wind carried the rhythm of hundreds of beating wings and fluttering feathers. Now, each call was precious, a solitary thread weaving through the heavy air. Her mate stood beside her, a steady presence in the shifting quiet. Together they navigated the narrow ledges, tending to their nest with care, guarding the fragile egg that might yet carry the hope of new life. But even this sanctuary felt fragile, vulnerable to the cold winds and the encroaching tides that gnawed ever closer. The sea had changed as well. The once abundant schools of fish had thinned, their silver flashes rarer beneath the surface. Storms came with increasing fury, sending waves crashing over the cliffs, erasing footprints and nests alike. The sky often wept with rain and snow, the light dim and fleeting. The colony's remaining members huddled close during these times, sharing warmth and the quiet comfort of shared survival. The young auk felt the weight of the years pressing down, the knowledge that this world she had known was slipping beyond the reach of wings and time. Still, amid the fading voices, there was a resilience that refused to break. The great auk lifted her head against the wind, her call a soft, enduring note that echoed against stone and sea. It was a song not of despair, but of memory, a reminder of the life that had flourished here, of the countless generations who had called these cliffs home. And though the voices grew fewer, the spirit of the colony lingered, etched into the rocks, carried on the waves, whispered in the hush between tides. The island held its breath, waiting for a future written in the quiet hope of those who remain. The sea had taken much, but not everything. Amid the endless sweep of waves and wind, a single island remained, a refuge, battered and worn, but still steadfast against the endless ocean. It was here, on this rugged patch of stone and salt, that the last of the great auks gathered. The island's cliffs, scarred by time and weather, bore silent witness to the struggle of a colony holding on by the thinnest of threads. The great auk stood tall upon the jagged ledges, her feathers dark and glossy, weighed by salt and sorrow yet unbowed. Beside her, her mate's eyes scanned the horizon, ever watchful, guarding not just their fragile nest but the fragile future it might hold. Their single egg rested in a hollow, nestled among weather-smoothed stones and bits of driftwood. The last hope of a lineage whispered in the winds. The island was no sanctuary of abundance. Food was scarce, the waters colder and emptier than before. She had learned to dive deeper, to linger longer beneath the icy surface, chasing fleeting shoals of fish in the shadowed blue. Each catch was hard-won, a gift from a sea that once overflowed with life, but now offered only precious fragments. Storms battered the cliffs with increasing fury, waves crashing higher and eroding the fragile edges of their home. Winds howled through crevices, carrying the salt and spray in sharp, stinging gusts. Yet, through it all, the colony clung together, small and fragile, a flicker of life against the vastness of the ocean. The great auk and her mate moved carefully along the ledges, tending to their nest, guarding their egg with a fierce tenderness born of desperation and hope. Their calls, once part of a chorus, were now solo notes, carrying across the empty spaces between rocks and waves. But even in solitude, those calls held strength, a testament to resilience, to the will to survive against impossible odds. At night, under a cold sky scattered with stars, the island breathed with the quiet rhythm of life holding fast. The great auk nestled close to her mate, the world reduced to the steady rise and fall of breath, the pulse of warmth in the endless chill. Somewhere beyond the dark water, the distant song of whales drifted like a promise, a reminder that even in the face of loss, life endures. And so the last safe island stood, an island of memories, of quiet hope, and of the enduring spirit of a species that had once ruled these northern seas. The great auk's story was nearing its close, but her song still rose, carried on the wind and sea, a soft echo of a life both fragile and fierce. It came slowly, this strange season. The great auk had lived through many cycles of the sea, winters of ice and hunger, summers of warmth and plenty. But this one was different. The winter's breath never truly returned. The cold that had always been the heartbeat of her world seemed to falter, replaced by a lingering warmth that sat upon the water and wrapped the cliffs in air that felt oddly heavy. The days stretched long, longer even than the summers she remembered. The sun lingered on the horizon at evening, reluctant to leave, painting the sky in smears of gold and rose before drifting into a pale, slow dusk. Nights felt thinner, as though the stars were watching from a greater distance, their light more hesitant in the softened dark. For the colony, the change was both gentle and unsettling. At first, they welcomed it. Storms came less often, the ledges dried quickly after rain, and the water seemed calm for days on end. The auk swam with her mate and felt the sea's warmth against her feathers, so unlike the sharp bite of seasons past. Yet, when she dove, the fish she sought were not where they should have been. They had moved, further out, deeper down, drawn to cooler waters the auk could not always reach. The familiar shoals were scattered, their silver bodies less dense, their movements more uncertain. Hunting took longer now, each dive a test of endurance. And though the sea still gave, it did so with a caution she had never known. Around her, other changes stirred. The wind carried scents of birds she had never met before, gulls from warmer shores, terns whose sharp cries split the air in new ways. They mingled at the edges of the colony, strangers among the familiar. Some stayed only a few days, riding the calm currents before vanishing toward far horizons. Others lingered, their wings casting new shadows across the rocks. The auk's days became a mix of old and new. Morning dives, slow swims along the kelp beds, afternoons spent in the drowsy warmth beside her mate. She tended to their egg with the same steady patience, though the sun's heat sometimes pressed too strongly against the shell, and she learned to shade it with her body. At night, when the water turned to glass under the pale moon, she would look toward the horizon, where the faint glow of distant storms seemed to tremble like thoughts not yet spoken. The ocean felt restless beneath the calm, its surface too smooth, its song quieter than it should be. The young among the colony played in the shallows longer now, their bodies cutting quick arcs through the warm tide. They did not yet know that the warmth was strange. For them, this endless summer was simply life as it should be, bright, calm, and kind. But the oak remembered winters of ice that reached the shore, of storms that carried the scent of deep-water fish to their very nests. She remembered abundance tied to the cold. And as the days passed without the sharp breath of frost, she wondered, quietly, without fear, but with the weight of knowing, if the summer might be here to stay, and what that might mean for the sea she had always trusted. The egg beneath her shifted faintly, a soft tremor beneath her breast. She leaned down, her beak brushing the warm shell. Life still came, even in strange seasons. And for now, the island still held them, the waves still kissed the stone, and the wind still carried the old songs across the cliffs. But somewhere, far beyond the horizon, the currents moved differently, as though the ocean was dreaming of another time. The summer that had stayed began to fade, not with the sudden sharpness of the winters she remembered, but with a slow, almost tender retreat. The air grew cooler in the evenings, yet never bit as it once had. The sea still glimmered with the softness of warmth, but there was something quieter beneath its surface, a stillness in the water that made the great auk pause before diving. She had learned to read the sea by its music, the ripples against stone, the hum of currents, the distant, deep calls that echoed through the water. Now, the song seemed thinned, its harmonies faded. Fish still swam in the shadows, but they were fewer, scattered into smaller shoals, their silver flashes rarer between the kelp fronds. The easy abundance of her younger years was gone, replaced by a patient searching, a careful waiting. The colony had changed too. Ledges, once crowded with the close press of bodies, were open now, spaces between nests widening like gaps in a woven net. Fewer voices rose at dawn, fewer shapes leapt from the stone to cut through the waves. The rhythm of daily life remained. Dives, feeding, the watch over eggs and chicks, but it moved at a slower, quieter pace, as if the island itself were breathing more gently. Some of the familiar faces were gone, their nests empty. The reasons were not always seen. A missing mate might have been lost in a storm, or wandered too far in search of fish, or simply never returned. There was no panic in the colony, only a soft adjusting, a shifting of space, the way the tide reshapes the shoreline without anger. The great auk and her mate kept to their ledge, their egg safe in its hollow. They took turns diving, their beaks still finding enough to sustain them. When she returned from the sea, she would stand beside him, pressing her feathers against his for warmth, and they would watch the horizon together. It was a horizon that seemed wider now, as if the absence of so many made the world feel larger than it had ever been. The days shortened, and the light slanted lower, laying long shadows over the stone. The wind's voice deepened, though it lacked the icy teeth of winters past. At night, the stars looked closer, their reflections scattered on the calm surface of the tide pools. Sometimes she would see a lone puffin or murray pass overhead, their silhouettes small against the pale moon, heading toward places she would never follow. There was no great ending, no sudden silence. The sea vanishing came softly, like mist lifting from the sea at dawn. Each day brought small absences, a voice missing from the morning calls, a ledge left bare, a favorite fishing cove quiet beneath the waves. Life continued, but the fullness that had once wrapped the island in sound and movement was thinning into a gentle, almost imperceptible hush. And yet the great auk carried on. She dove, she fed, she sheltered the egg beneath her breast, and she called to her mate in the fading light. The island was still hers. The sea, though changed, still rose to meet the stone. And in the spaces left behind by all that had gone, there was a strange, fragile beauty, like the hush before a snowfall, or the last light of evening lingering long after the sun has set. Somewhere within her, she understood that this was not just a season, but something deeper, a turning of the tide that would not turn back. Still, she stayed, as all her kind had stayed, held by the pull of the place where land and sea touched, where the wind carried the memory of every wing that had ever risen from these cliffs. And in that quiet, the vanishing continued, gentle, steady, and sure as the tide. The days had become softer, quieter still. The great auk moved more slowly now, her dives shorter, her time upon the ledges longer. The sea she had once raced through felt heavier against her body, each current wrapping her in a deep, deliberate calm. She no longer chased the swiftest fish, content instead to follow the slower shoals, taking what she needed without urgency. The hunger that once pressed her into the cold depths had eased into a steady, gentle rhythm. Her mate stayed close. They no longer ranged far apart in their searching. He dove when she rested, and when he returned, she met him with a low croak that seemed to carry more memory than greeting. Together they stood upon the rocks, watching the sea breathe in and out, as if it too had grown older. Around them, the colony's voices were faint. Only a handful of pairs remained now, scattered along the familiar ledges. The air between their calls was long with silence, yet there was no fear in that quiet, only the weight of years, the slow folding away of a story that had been told for generations. The auk felt herself a part of something vast, something that did not end simply because it grew smaller. The egg they had tended that year had not hatched. It lay still in its shallow nest, its shell unbroken, its promise returned to the stone. She had watched over it all the same, not in denial, but in a kind of gentle keeping. The egg had been part of the rhythm, and she honored it until the winds began to lift the kelp strands from around it and carry them away. Her body felt different now, heavier, slower, though without pain. There was a deep tiredness in her bones, as if the tide itself had begun to flow through her, drawing her gradually toward its center. She found herself lingering longer at the water's edge, letting the cold foam curl over her feet, the salt sting her skin. One morning, when the horizon was pale with the first light, she stepped down into the shallows and floated there, her body rising and falling with the gentle swell. Her mate stood nearby on the rock, watching but not following. The water cradled her like a memory, its cool arms steady, its pulse matching her own. She drifted beyond the first line of foam, where the swell was smoother, and the air was filled with nothing but the sound of her own breathing. There was no moment of choice, no sharp break. She simply stayed there, letting the tide take her further. The cliffs softened in the distance. The cries of the gulls grew faint. Beneath her the water was dark and endless, the currents slow and kind. Her eyes closed, not from weariness, but because the light on the water was so warm, so steady, that there was nothing more to see. The ocean's song wrapped around her, a low, endless hum. She thought of the ledges filled with the calls of her kin, of the summer sun spilling over the basalt, of the first time she dove into the deep blue and felt the world open all around her. She thought of her mate's call across the water, the weight of an egg beneath her breast, the quiet strength of winter moons. All of it was here still, folded into the sea's embrace. And in that embrace, she drifted further, until there was no boundary between her body and the water, between her breath and the tide. The island lay behind her, small and still beneath the rising sun. Ahead, the sea opened without end, carrying her into the deep, steady rest she had always known waited at the heart of the waves. The sea keeps everything. Every wave that ever touched the shore, every echo of wind that once swept across an open cliff, every shadow that passed beneath the surface. It remembers in ways no book or voice can, deep, wordless ways, carried in its salt and current, its endless pulse against the turning of the world. It remembers the great auk, her shape, dark and sleek, moving through the green-blue depths with wings folded tight and feet driving her forward. The sharp gleam of her beak as it broke the surface, silver fish clasped within. The weight of her body resting on the stone, feathers warmed by the low northern sun. The calls that rose from her throat, low, steady, unhurried, threads in the tapestry of voices that once bound the cliffs to the water. The ocean remembers the way she belonged. There had been no hesitation in her movements, no question of her place here. She was of the sea as much as the salt and the tide, as much as the silver flash of the capelin or the sway of the kelp forests far below. She lived in the rhythm of it, season to season, storm to calm, night to day. And in living, she gave herself entirely to the balance that shaped her world. The sea remembers the island, too. The black basalt rising from its waters, the sharp cliffs weathered by centuries of spray and wind. It remembers the colony, thousands of dark bodies pressing close in the winter wind, eggs cradled against stone, the air thick with calls and the scent of salt and feathers. It remembers the soft beating of countless hearts, each one tuned to the pull of the tide. It remembers the changes, the warmth that lingered too long, the ships whose sails swelled like strange white wings, the nets that moved with a speed and finality no predator of the sea had ever known. It remembers the silences that followed. But memory, for the ocean, is not sorrow. It does not weep for what is gone. It carries all things, holding them in the same deep embrace. The great auk is not lost to it. She is here still, in the cool currents that slip around the island's base, in the shadows that glide beneath the surface, in the quiet shape of the waves as they fold toward shore. When the moon rises and paints the water silver, the sea hums with the voices it has kept. The low calls of the auks mingle with the cries of gulls, the rush of tides through hidden channels, the far-off song of whales. To those who listen closely, there is no dividing the living from the gone. All are present in the endless breathing of the sea. The ocean remembers the last morning she swam. It remembers the way her body rose and fell with the swell, how the horizon seemed to open for her alone, how she closed her eyes not in fear, but in ease, as if she had finally returned to the heart of something that had always been waiting. It remembers how she drifted, and how the sun touched her feathers like a blessing. And so, the sea holds her. Not as a ghost, but as a note in an unending song. Not as a story that has ended, but as a current that continues to move, unseen, beneath the surface of time. Far above, on calm days, the waves fold gently over the basalt. The wind slips along the cliffs, whispering in the cracks where nests once lay. Gulls wheel and cry, their shadows dark over the white foam. The island stands, smaller in voice but still steadfast, and the ocean wraps its arms around it again and again, as it has for millennia. In this way, nothing is truly gone. The great auk remains, not in body, but in the shape of the water, in the memory of the tides, in the pull of the currents that still sing to the cliffs. And when night comes, when the stars lean low over the dark water and the moon spills its light across the sea, the ocean carries her name, softly, endlessly, back to the rocks she once called home. She is gone, and still she is everywhere.